Dorothy stood at the edge of her garden, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across her tomato plants. At 73, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that age wasn't about the number of candles on your birthday cake. It was about the fire that still burned inside you. "Most people my age can't do what I'm about to show you," she said to herself, a gentle smile playing at the corners of her lips. It wasn't boasting. It was simply the truth she discovered through decades of living intentionally. What Dorothy could still do at her age would surprise most people. It wasn't running marathons or lifting heavy weights. It wasn't about defying her years or pretending to be someone she wasn't. Instead, it was something far more profound, something that researchers now believe is the single strongest predictor of whether someone will not just survive, but truly thrive well into their 90s and beyond. The secret had nothing to do with expensive supplements or complicated exercise routines. It wasn't about following the latest health fad or spending hours at the gym. What Dorothy possessed was something that modern medicine is only beginning to understand, a form of emotional wisdom that comes from embracing life after 60 with genuine acceptance and inner strength. Senior empowerment, she had learned, wasn't about fighting against the natural process of aging. It was about dancing with it. Every morning when she woke up, Dorothy practiced something that most people half her age struggled to master. This simple daily ritual had transformed not just her physical health, but her entire outlook on independent living. Her neighbors often commented on how different she seemed from other people her age. While others complained about their aches and pains, Dorothy moved through her days with a lightness that seemed to defy gravity itself. While others worried constantly about the future, she had found a way to remain present and engaged with life that radiated outward, touching everyone around her. The medical community is finally catching up to what Dorothy intuitively understood. Recent studies have shown that people who maintain this particular ability well into their 70s and 80s have dramatically lower rates of heart disease, depression, and cognitive decline. They sleep better, have stronger immune systems, and yes, they consistently outlive their peers by decades. But here's what makes Dorothy truly special. She hadn't always possessed this gift. 20 years ago, she was like most people approaching retirement, anxious about the future, dwelling on past regrets, and feeling like her best days were behind her. The transformation came when she stumbled upon a simple practice that changed everything. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Dorothy received news that would have devastated most people her age. Instead of falling apart, something unexpected happened. In that moment of crisis, she discovered an inner resource she never knew she had, a wellspring of emotional resilience that would become her greatest asset in the years that followed. What Dorothy learned that day forms the foundation of what researchers now call successful aging. It's not about denying the realities of getting older. It's about developing a specific mindset that allows you to navigate life's challenges with grace and wisdom. As she stood in her garden that morning, Dorothy was about to demonstrate the very thing that set her apart from 95% of people her age. It was deceptively simple, yet profoundly powerful. And if you're between 65 and 80 and can still do what Dorothy was preparing to show, the research suggests you might just be destined to celebrate your 100th birthday with the same vitality and joy she embodied every single day. But first, Dorothy had to face the phone call that was about to change everything. The phone rang at exactly 7:47 a.m., just as it had every Tuesday for the past 3 years. Dorothy knew without looking that it was her daughter, Sarah, calling from across the country with that familiar mix of love and worry in her voice. "Mom, I've been thinking," Sarah would always begin, and Dorothy would brace herself for another conversation about moving to assisted living, selling the house, or being more realistic about your limitations. But this Tuesday felt different. As Dorothy walked toward the phone, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since retirement 15 years ago. Back then, she had been like so many others facing life after retirement, lost, purposeless, and secretly terrified that her most meaningful days were behind her. Her husband Robert had passed away just 2 years into their golden years together. They had made so many plans, saved so carefully, dreamed of traveling and spending time with grandchildren. When he died suddenly of a heart attack, Dorothy felt like she had lost not just her partner, but her entire sense of direction. For months, she had wandered through her days in a fog of grief and confusion. Finding purpose seemed impossible when the future she had envisioned had vanished overnight. She remembered sitting in their empty house, surrounded by photo albums and memories, wondering if this was all there was left, just waiting for time to pass. The turning point came during what she now called her dark winter. She had been avoiding friends, declining invitations, and slowly withdrawing from life. Her children worried constantly, calling with suggestions that only made her feel more isolated and misunderstood. That's when she discovered something that would fundamentally change her approach to senior reflection and emotional resilience. It happened during a particularly difficult evening when she found herself crying over a box of Robert's old letters. Instead of pushing the sadness away or trying to stay positive, as everyone kept telling her to do, Dorothy made a surprising choice. She decided to sit with the pain, to really feel it, and to honor what it was trying to teach her. In that moment of complete surrender, something extraordinary happened. Beneath the grief, she found a wellspring of gratitude for the love she had experienced. Beneath the fear, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Beneath the loneliness, she found a deep connection to something larger than herself. This wasn't positive thinking or denial. It was something far more profound. Dorothy had learned to embrace the full spectrum of human experience without being overwhelmed by it. She had developed what psychologists now recognize as advanced emotional regulation, the ability to feel deeply while remaining centered. Over the following months, this newfound emotional wisdom transformed every aspect of her life. She began volunteering at the local literacy center, discovering a passion for helping others that gave her days new meaning. She started tending her garden with mindful attention, finding peace in the simple rhythms of planting and harvesting. Most importantly, she learned to view each day not as something to get through, but as an opportunity to practice living fully. Her friends noticed the change immediately. Where others complained about aches and ailments, Dorothy spoke about what she was learning. Where others focused on what they could no longer do, she explored new possibilities. Where others seemed to shrink with age, Dorothy somehow expanded, becoming more herself with each passing year. Now, as the phone continued to ring, Dorothy wondered if today would be the day she finally shared her secret with Sarah. The conversation that was about to unfold would test everything she had learned about emotional resilience and the true meaning of aging gracefully. She picked up the phone, not knowing that Sarah's words would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own strength. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Sarah's voice carried a tremor that Dorothy had never heard before. "I've been talking to David and Patricia, and we're all worried. Really worried." Dorothy settled into her favorite chair, the one Robert had reupholstered for her 40th birthday. As she listened to her daughter's concerns, her mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with her sister Helen just last week. Helen, 5 years younger but already requiring a walker, had expressed the same fears that now echoed in Sarah's voice. "You're living alone in that big house, Mom. What if you fall? What if something happens and no one finds you for days?" These were the conversations that defined so many people's experience of aging gracefully. Dorothy understood her children's love masked their terror of losing her, just as her own mother's decline had terrified her decades ago. But what her family didn't understand was that Dorothy had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Not through denial or stubbornness, but through a deep practice of senior mindfulness that had fundamentally changed her relationship with uncertainty. After Robert's death, Dorothy had initially fallen into the same trap that catches so many in their later years. She had begun to define herself by her limitations rather than her possibilities. The mirror reflected wrinkles and gray hair, so she saw herself as diminished. Her energy wasn't what it used to be, so she assumed she was becoming irrelevant. Society's messages about aging had slowly convinced her that her best years were behind her. But that transformative winter had taught her something profound about the difference between growing older and aging gracefully. She had learned that true senior empowerment wasn't about fighting the natural changes in her body. It was about cultivating an unshakable inner foundation that could weather any storm. Dorothy had discovered what researchers now call post-traumatic growth, the ability to find meaning and strength through life's most difficult experiences. Her grief over Robert's death had initially threatened to destroy her, but through patient self-compassion and deliberate spiritual practice, it had become the source of her greatest wisdom. She began each morning with 20 minutes of quiet reflection, not meditation exactly, but a gentle turning inward that allowed her to check in with her emotional state without judgment. This practice of senior reflection had revealed something remarkable. Beneath the surface anxieties about aging lay a deep well of acceptance and even excitement about what lay ahead. "I know you mean well, sweetheart," Dorothy said gently to Sarah, "but I want you to understand something. Your father and I used to have the same conversations about his mother. We were so focused on what could go wrong that we missed seeing what was going right." Dorothy remembered her mother-in-law, Catherine, who had lived independently until 94, not because she was stubborn or reckless, but because she had maintained what Dorothy now recognized as exceptional emotional resilience. Catherine had faced her share of health challenges and losses, but she had never lost her curiosity about life or her connection to her own inner strength. "The thing is, Sarah, there's something I've been learning about myself these past few years. Something that might surprise you." Dorothy paused, choosing her words carefully. "What if I told you that I feel more capable now, more centered, than I did when I was 50? The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that Dorothy wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was thick with confusion and something that sounded almost like fear. "Mom, that's exactly what we're worried about. You're not seeing things clearly anymore." Dorothy's heart sank as she realized the conversation she had been preparing for was about to become more challenging than she had ever imagined. "Sarah, honey, I understand your concern, but..." "No, Mom, you don't understand." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "We've been talking to Dr. Martinez about early signs of cognitive decline. The way you've been talking lately, these new hobbies, this sudden confidence, it's not normal for someone your age." Dorothy felt something cold settle in her stomach. Her own children thought her newfound vitality was a symptom of mental deterioration. The irony was almost unbearable. The very qualities that made her feel most alive were being interpreted as evidence that she was losing herself. "What if I came to visit next month?" Sarah continued. "We could have you evaluated just to be safe. There are wonderful facilities now, Mom. Places where you could have independence, but also support." Before Dorothy could respond, her doorbell rang. She glanced toward the front door, confused. It was barely 8 in the morning, and she wasn't expecting anyone. "Sarah, someone's at the door. Can I call you back?" "See? This is what I mean, Mom. Who visits at this hour? You need to be more careful about." Dorothy gently hung up and walked to the door, her mind reeling from the conversation. Through the peephole, she saw a woman about her own age, well-dressed but nervous, holding what appeared to be an old photograph. "Can I help you?" Dorothy called through the door. "I'm looking for Dorothy Chun. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I think you might be my sister." Dorothy's hand froze on the doorknob. The name hit her like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories she had buried for over 50 years. Margaret, her little sister who had been adopted when Dorothy was 12, lost to a family system that had torn them apart during the Great Depression. With trembling fingers, Dorothy unlocked the door. The woman standing on her porch had the same green eyes, the same stubborn chin that Dorothy remembered from a frightened 8-year-old girl who had cried when the social workers came. "Maggie," Dorothy whispered. Margaret held up the photograph, a faded image of 2 girls in worn dresses, arms wrapped around each other. Dorothy recognized it immediately. It was the last picture taken of them together before they were separated. "I've been looking for you for 30 years, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Ever since my adoptive parents died, and I found this in their papers. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago." Dorothy's legs felt weak. This moment, this rediscovery after 60 years of believing her sister was lost forever, threatened to overwhelm every coping strategy she had developed. The emotional resilience that had sustained her through Robert's death, through loneliness and grief, suddenly felt inadequate in the face of this impossible gift. I live in Oregon now, Margaret continued, stepping closer. I've been a teacher, married, divorced, had 3 children. But not a day went by that I didn't wonder about my big sister Dorothy, who used to sing me to sleep. Dorothy reached out and touched Margaret's face. The same gesture she had made the night before they were separated, when she had promised her little sister that they would find each other again someday. "You kept your promise," Margaret whispered. As Dorothy embraced her sister for the first time in 6 decades, she realized that everything she thought she knew about new beginnings and healing family bonds was about to be tested in ways she never could have imagined. Because Margaret hadn't come alone, and the news she carried would change not just Dorothy's understanding of her past, but her entire future. "Dorothy," Margaret said, pulling back to look into her eyes, "there's something else you need to know about why I really came to find you now." Margaret's hands shook as she reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. 3 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The doctors say I have maybe 2 good years left before things get really difficult. She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let myself forget you again, Dorothy. Not when I finally found you." Dorothy felt the world tilt beneath her feet. After 60 years of separation, they had found each other just in time to say goodbye again. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Here was her sister, facing the very thing her own children feared was happening to Dorothy. "But that's not the only reason I came," Margaret continued, her eyes brightening with sudden determination. "Dorothy, I've spent the last 6 months learning everything I could about you. I know about Robert's death, about how you transformed your grief into something beautiful. I know about your volunteer work, your garden, the way you've embraced life after loss." Dorothy stared at her sister, confused by the sudden shift in Margaret's tone. "What I'm trying to tell you is this. Watching you from afar these past months has taught me more about wisdom with age than anything I've experienced in my own life. You've shown me what it means to truly live, not just survive." At that moment, Dorothy's phone rang again. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Dorothy realized this was life's turning point after 60 that she had been unconsciously preparing for all along. "Sarah," Dorothy answered, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening in her living room. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about feeling more capable now than when you were 50. I talked to David after we hung up, and he reminded me of something." Dorothy's heart began to race as she sensed a shift in her daughter's voice. "He said that Grandpa Robert used to tell him the same thing about you, that you became more yourself, more confident as you got older. David said Robert always called it your late-blooming magic." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Mom, I think I owe you an apology. I've been so scared of losing you that I stopped seeing who you really are." Dorothy looked at Margaret, who was listening intently, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, there's someone here I'd like you to meet," Dorothy said, reaching for her sister's hand. "Someone who's going to help all of us understand what real courage looks like." As Dorothy began to tell Sarah about Margaret's arrival and diagnosis, she realized that the mysterious ability she had developed wasn't just emotional resilience or advanced self-awareness. It was something far more profound: the capacity to hold both joy and sorrow simultaneously, to embrace the full complexity of human experience without being crushed by it. Margaret squeezed Dorothy's hand and whispered, "This is exactly what I hoped would happen. You're going to show me how to face what's coming with grace, aren't you?" Dorothy understood then that her journey toward emotional closure hadn't been about healing from the past. It had been about preparing for this moment, when she would need to be strong enough to guide both her biological family and her rediscovered sister through the most difficult chapters of their lives. "We're going to face it together," Dorothy said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence that comes only from having walked through fire and emerged stronger. "All of us." The phone call that had started with fear and misunderstanding was transforming into something none of them had expected. A bridge toward deeper connection, built on the foundation of Dorothy's hard-won wisdom and unshakable inner strength. 6 months later, Dorothy stood in the same spot in her garden where this journey had begun, but everything had changed. Margaret sat nearby in a comfortable chair, her memory still sharp enough to share stories about their childhood that Dorothy had thought were lost forever. Sarah visited every other weekend now, not out of worry, but out of genuine desire to spend time with the mother she was finally seeing clearly. The morning ritual that had sustained Dorothy through her darkest years had evolved into something even more meaningful. Now it included quiet moments with Margaret, sharing coffee and watching the sunrise, talking about everything and nothing while they still could. These conversations had become sacred, each one a small victory against time and circumstance. "You know what I've learned?" Margaret said one Tuesday morning, the anniversary of that first phone call. "All those years I spent searching for you. I thought I was looking for my past. But what I really found was permission to live fully in whatever time I have left." Dorothy smiled, understanding exactly what her sister meant. The ability that had set her apart from others her age wasn't about defying the natural process of aging or pretending that loss and limitation didn't exist. It was about developing what she now called sacred acceptance, the capacity to embrace each day as it came, with all its joys and sorrows, without needing it to be different than it was. Sarah had struggled at first to understand this concept. During one of their weekend visits, she had asked, "Mom, how do you stay so positive when everything is falling apart?" Dorothy had taken her daughter's hands and explained that it wasn't about positivity. It was about presence. It was about showing up fully for life, even when life included difficulty, loss, and uncertainty. The timeless lessons Dorothy had learned weren't complex or revolutionary. They were simple truths that became profound through practice. She had learned to grieve without drowning, to hope without attachment, to love without guarantee. Most importantly, she had discovered that senior resilience wasn't about being strong enough to handle anything. It was about being flexible enough to bend without breaking. Margaret's diagnosis had initially seemed like a cruel twist of fate, but it had actually become the catalyst for healing that none of them had known they needed. Watching her sister face an uncertain future with courage and grace had helped Sarah understand that her mother's transformation wasn't a sign of decline, but evidence of growth that could happen at any stage of life. The rare ability that Dorothy possessed, the one that researchers said could predict longevity and well-being, was simply this: she had learned to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. Instead of letting external circumstances dictate her internal state, she had cultivated an inner foundation so solid that it could weather any storm. On quiet evenings, when the 3 generations of women sat together on Dorothy's porch, sharing stories and planning for an uncertain future, Dorothy often reflected on life's quiet victories. The biggest triumph wasn't that she had lived to 73 in good health, though that was a blessing. It wasn't that she had found her sister after 60 years, though that was a miracle. The real victory